Um, I'm going to do a quick introduction of both of our speakers today on authors, and then we'll get into some Q&A with me asking questions of them. And then at the end, we'll have time for your questions. And if you want to start to populate the chat room with questions as they come up, you can do that. We won't address them to the end, but it might be a way for you to get your question out there and not forget it before the end of the session. So at this point, I'll ask everybody except for Cheryl and Cherise to mute. Yeah, the chat should be open to you as we go. So thanks again for being here. So I welcome you to Conversation with Authors today, joining Cherise, Hairston, and Cheryl Jamison as they talk about important insights for transformative practitioners from their chapters in the book Beyond Equity and Inclusion and Conflict Resolution, Recentering the Profession. I've read this book. It's a phenomenal book. So many voices, poems. It's just an amazing book. My name is Kristine Paranica. I think most of you know who I am. I've been a fellow of the Institute for quite a long time, and I'm excited to lift up the voices of these two beautiful souls who are my colleagues and friends. First, Cheryl Jamison. She is a highly qualified conflict manager. She has had the privilege of working in diverse spaces, including all levels of government, as an investigator and mediator of civil rights complaints. As director of the Maryland Program for Mediator Excellence, she developed a program to aid mediators to improve the quality of their practice. She has developed and presented workshops on various topics related to diversity and inclusion. As an educator, Cheryl has designed, developed, and delivered courses at several colleges and universities. In addition to a Juris Doctorate, she has a master's degree in counseling and personnel and a bachelor's degree in psychology. Welcome, Cheryl.
Thank you.
Cherise Hairston is a certified transformative mediator with the Institute, a certified professional coach with Coactive Training Institute, the International Coaching Federation, and a certified positive intelligence mental fitness coach with Positive Intelligence, Inc. Cheryl is a 2018 recipient of the City of Dayton Joseph T. Klein Award, a fellow of the Institute, an elder board of directors with the National Association for Community Mediation, also known as NAFCOM, and is an adjunct faculty member with the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School of Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason. Cherise's conflict intervention career spans more than 27 years as a practitioner, trainer, coach, mentor, and published academic scholar. Cherise has been a team member with the Dayton Center since 1999 and is the mediation coordinator. I'm happy to say I've worked with both of these ladies over a few decades.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, I know, right? So the first question is to both of you. Just because my screen looks like this, we'll start with Cheryl and then go to Cherise. So the first question is, the title of this book is Beyond Equity and Inclusion and Conflict Resolution, Recentering the Profession. So what is recentering the profession to you?
So probably this is a better question to ask to the editors of the book, since I got the title. But for me, recentering usually means going back to the beginning, going back to the center. And I think if I were speaking for the editors who came up with this title, I would say that part of it is for us as conflict resolution practitioners, managers, however you see yourself, is to come to a place where we are actually doing what we say we're doing. It's beyond the words equity and inclusion. It's to what does that mean really? When a person walks into a space, what does that mean to them? And how can we as a profession actually emulate what is going beyond those words mean? That's what it meant to me as I did my chapter. So that's what I would say. I wonder if they'd say the same thing.
Probably not. I'll jump in. I think, like Cheryl, this is a part title from the previous book. So there's a book from 2008. That really was the kind of first effort of this group of amazing practitioners. And I think when we go back to that, what I often think of is actually one of my favorite feminist theory books by Bell Hooks, From Margin to Center. And really, for me, what the title means is that if we think about the whole of the field of conflict resolution, conflict intervention, and the center of it, the practitioners that are writing this book, including myself and Cheryl, may have been on the margins, or may have excluded or omitted or just invisible. And so when I think about the whole of the field, this recentering on kind of what is inclusive of all voices, and in the context of this book, really bringing in some of the voices that have been left out, silenced, and are invisible, and really from that frame of reference, really amplifying, looking at how they see this work. So it's a recentering, is to bring back to the center and bring back to the whole. So that's my take. I think Mary and Beth and SY and Hassan would probably give us both a thumbs up on the title, but we didn't have anything to do with the title.
That's great. I appreciate that. So back to Cheryl, how did this group of practitioners come together to create this amazing book of voices? And what has it meant for you to hear your own voice through your writing?
So I'm actually not quite sure how they put this list together. I know how they came to me, and I can certainly talk to that. So when SY, actually, she and I were talking, and I knew about the book, and she asked me, why don't I write a chapter? It's like, oh yeah, sure, right. Why don't I just write, just sit down and write a chapter? And it's the question of me writing about my experiences in conflict resolution organizations was not new. I'd been asked to do that before and had said no. And the reason I said no was because I couldn't figure out, quite frankly, how to write it without sounding like an angry Black woman. My experiences were not all that pleasant, although I'm glad I did it, and I'm glad for the accomplishments I had. I just couldn't figure out an angle, if you will, a hook that would allow me to tell the story without the hurt and anger that came with it. And so in talking to SY, we landed upon, well, write it as if you would have liked it to have been. What would you have liked to have had happen? So as I thought about that, for me, it was, I can take some of the experiences, and I can then end it by giving suggestions on what for me, an atmosphere or an environment of belonging and connectedness would look like. And so that took away the anger part, although some of that is still there, and probably some of that still comes through. But for me, it was the ability to write about these spaces and the experiences with the hope that organizations and individuals would read it and see where they are in terms of creating an environment of belonging and connectedness, and how they might be get closer to the mark. So that's how I got into it. And then realized, after saying yes, then I saw the list of these amazing individuals and started reading some of their work, and was just honored to be included in that group of people.
Wonderful.
Like Cherise, for example.
That's right.
Well, I'll jump on in. I have had the privilege of being included in the first book of PRASI, and PRASI is the Practitioners Research Scholarship Institute, and that was started well over 20 years ago by Mary Adams Trujillo, Beth Roy, S.Y. Bolin, and Hassan Batts. And I think, to go back to that the effort has been over these 20 plus years is to really focus on voices in the field that have, and from my perspective, if you go to the literature, the academic literature, the scholarship, if you go to books, if you go to the conferences, whose voices were kind of left out. And so really the effort of Prosse has been to bring together those voices and really support young voices, voices from people who traditionally have been left out. So writing about issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And really, as Cheryl said, calling the field to live up to what it says it was doing or is designed to do, which is to really, in one part, help people come together across difference and to figure out how to engage that difference, that conflict constructively. And so their work really has, I have to honor them because their work is just, it's been kind of that one thread through my career that really has given me some sustenance, because otherwise I felt actually quite alone in the issues that I cared about, and then just my own experiences. So I've had the privilege of knowing the book editors for most of my career. And I think what they're really trying to do is carve out that space in our field to say, hey, these issues matter, and how can we as a field that's oriented toward conflict intervention, peace education, restorative practices, where diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice really do matter. And the people that we're serving, we have to get that right as practitioners. And so I think they've paved that path for so many of us who care about these issues.
Thank you both for that. As you're talking, I'm remembering conversations I've had with each of you, with Cheryl, when we were co-chairs of ACR conference, and Cherise at more than one symposia of some of these same issues. So I can imagine that this is perhaps somewhat cathartic, this writing that you did to some degree. So the next question will take a little more time with each author. For Cherise, your chapter is called Aggregating Wisdom, Amplifying Voices, Conflict Resolution Practitioners of African Descent, and is really, at least in my mind, in part, about the politics around an absence of Black authors. Tell us about the importance of this topic for you through your lived experience, including all those 20-some interviews with the African American practitioners, and what themes stood out for you.
Well, this is, why I'm here really starts 27 years ago, which is when I decided to do the master's program in conflict resolution and at Antioch and Yellow Springs. And I think if any of you who have gone to graduate school kind of think back on your topic and the things that you were interested in, I'm really no different. And so as a woman of African descent and of other identities, what I was interested in is how does conflict resolution, what's that look like for African Americans? What do African American mediators think about and other practitioners in conflict? And that really is the journey that got started back then when I went into the academic literature and found virtually nothing that was helpful to me. And if you think about the implications of being in graduate school and not being able to draw upon your field's academic literature, that's what I was faced with. And as part of an assignment, I wrote about that. I wrote about the neglect, what I thought was, if I can't find anything in the literature about African Americans, and there were some things, but it didn't give me any theoretical understanding of what it means to practice, to support people of African American descent, African descent. And so that's how I got started. And so in 1999, I was able to publish that graduate project in Mediation Quarterly. And so really since 1999, I've really been looking to our field and to the literature to see what we know and how we're growing. And so my chapter in this book really is the third time I've come and looked at this same topic. What do we know about African Americans when it comes to the practice of conflict intervention and mediation? Where's the research? Who's writing the research? What does it say? Is it empirically grounded so we have some knowledge? And fortunately, that small body of literature has been growing, but my chapter really reflects a third time. So 1999, my first book chapter in this anthology was in 2008. And I had a chance to, some many years later in 2020, revisit and look at it. And so I wanted to do something a little bit different because we were asked to imagine what a world would be like without racism. And the George Floyd murder, among many other murders, was happening in 2020 along with the pandemic. And I just couldn't. I was just like beside myself. All of my conflict resolution knowledge was going out the door. I was going to go out of my house against the pandemic lockdown and just, I don't know, do something that was not reflective of who I was, because my distress and rage and my trauma from seeing that murder played over in the countless African Americans who've been killed in our country. And so I decided to do something that was much more life affirming and giving, which was to find a new group of African American practitioners. I had interviewed 20 practitioners for my dissertation work that I did about 10 years prior. So I wanted to find a different group of people who were doing this work, African Americans doing this work. And we just had these lovely conversations that were really hopeful for me. I could go on, but I want to give room for Cheryl. But for me, it's a hopeful chapter. It's saying, you know, what we think, how we feel, our voices do matter when it comes to this work. And if we're as a field really concerned about moving forward and truly living up to the words and values of this field, we really have to do much better at being inclusive of voices that have tended to be left out. So that's really what my chapter is. And if you hadn't had a chance to look at it, it's really powerful to hear the voices. And so it was less about what I thought about the field and more about what these 20 African American practitioners felt about the field.
Cherise, do you want to say a little bit more about those interviews and what you heard? You do have a few more minutes left, about 4 minutes left.
Sure. I think the practitioners and the practitioners I interviewed were of African descent. So I had some folks from immigrants in the country for a while, some African Americans, many in community mediation centers, many in private practice, many just across the field. And I think the impact of exclusion. So we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and I think we need to talk about the impact of exclusion and what the impact of that is to not have your voice included or ignored, or when you use your voice to suffer from that. And so it was a good reminder of that was throughout all of the 20 interviews where it really is challenging to not be valued for what they brought to the table, and they bring much to the table, a great deal of creativity. But despite that, the one thing that really impressed upon me is this, I call it a calling. Since I don't want to raise this work up to calling, vocational calling, but it's that for me. And one of my interviews called it a ministry, the work. And she happened to be a transformative practitioner. So that's awesome, right? So we know how amazing it can be at that level, the non-directiveness of this. So everyone I talk to really has passion and commitment for this work, and to feel some levels of exclusion or a cost to being a person of African descent While that's hard to deal with emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, the work and the commitment to the work and serving others, I think, is really what lifted me up in those interviews. And lastly, what I will say, as I was struggling to get my sanity in the midst of insanity in our world, the world was on fire. Talking with them, being in relationship with them, learning from them really helped me get my grounding back and for lack of a better word, get back in the blue, right? Because my bank of red was my weakness, self-absorption was like, plenty. And I had no bank of blue to draw on my strength and responsiveness. So their interviews were really just life affirming and life giving to me.
I love that about your research, that how it gave back to you and how important it was to have those interviews and have those other voices lifted. So Cheryl,
Yes, ma'am.
your chapter is called Achieving Belonging and Connectedness: How do Organizations Welcome or Rebuff? And your personal experiences as a Black conflict practitioner is predominantly white organizations such as the Institute, frankly. What are some key realizations about the lack of inclusion in the organizations you have worked in? What's been your experience?
Well, as I said before, my experience in a number of organizations, not just the Institute, but others, as a whole, as a Black female, was not as positive as one would have liked. There are instances, too many of them, where it became clear that my race was a major factor in how I was being treated or not being treated. And for me, I have to say, I had the privilege of working with people such as Luke Easel and Rachel Wall, who gave me access to areas of the field that I might not have had access before. So I'm, talking to and involved in upper echelons of a number of organizations within our field. And what I found was, to my surprise, and I guess it really shouldn't have been, but to my surprise, it was that when issues of race, and I'll use race because that was what was prominent for me, when they came up, the reaction was the same that I would have expected from people who did not deal with and did not assist others in dealing with conflict. It was the same. It was, how dare you call me racist? How dare you? It was all of the denials and little of any ability to listen to what was happening. And I kept running against that over and over. And so when I was presented with the idea, with the conversation with SY, to talk about what would I have liked to have seen, what would for me have been an area consistently of belonging and connectedness, then that kind of refocused things for me. One of the things that I realized is that when I don't think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and most of us don't, when we decide to enter into an organization, that's not what you think about. I don't think about the numbers, although I look around, I do, to see if there's anybody who looks like me. But what really will keep me and keep most of us is if there is a sense that I belong here, that this is a space where I can, contribute and be productive. And is there a connection? Especially when we're volunteering. If this is my time, I'm not getting paid for this. So I kept looking for that. And in doing this chapter, I realized there were some things that I actually looked for that I don't know that I had put in as succinct a manner as I did in the chapter. And I found that most times those things were lacking. And one of them was a place to take a complaint when something happens. Something happens. Take any of the examples in my chapter, for example, when I realized that I'm applying for a position in a conflict resolution organization, and I suddenly realized that what is happening is because I am Black. Why these things are happening, why all of a sudden the process has changed. The process was one way, had been one way for years, and now all of a sudden we want a different process. And so I think about that. I don't think about numbers. I think about, oh, wait a minute, this isn't a place, this isn't where I thought I belonged. I thought I was connected. So, and there's no place to take it. There's no body within the organization to talk to about this. Now, again, I was fortunate. I had a wonderful ally who's sitting right there. So I could talk to Lou for most of this. There are some organizations that he wasn't a part of. So yeah, now most people have figured out some of this is ACR, and yes, it was. There's no reason to hide that. But I had the ability to pick up the phone or walk in an office and say, this is what's happening. So that's what got me through it. But there was no real place within the organizations, a number of them, where this kind of conversation could take place with the intent of, and I won't even say resolving, I'll say managing this so that people stayed. So what happened was other people this happened to, and they left. There wasn't a regular conversation about race and the other dimensions of diversity. So if something happens with regard to race, and now we have to talk about it, a difficult conversation to begin with, but there's no foundation. We haven't ever talked about this before. Chances are there's not going to be a meaningful, productive conversation because we've never had this before. So organizations that don't make as a regular practice some form of belonging and connectedness conversation or activity. Doesn't have to be race, but we need to get comfortable as conflict resolution practitioners dealing with this matter ourselves, not our clients, because we seem to be fairly good at talking to our clients about what they should do. We're not that good at doing what we tell our clients to do. And it takes practice. It's not something that you are automatically born with. It takes practice to have productive conversations about race. So being able to look at what I would have liked allowed me to stop getting angry about what happened, because it happened and it's over. And I was able to do, I think, some good work. But what are the things that I would like to see? So a place to take it, regular conversations, about it, regular, educational and other kinds of conversations. And then making sure that your process for me as a Black female is the same as everyone else, because it wasn't. And that was another thing that's like, whoa. So looking at it from that lens and looking at what I would have liked and what I would recommend allowed me, I think, to say things that are beneficial to an organization that is really looking to develop an environment of belonging and connectedness. And while I talk about race, we all know that there are other dimensions of diversity out there in which our organizations do not represent. And why is that? It's not that they don't have conflict. It's not that there aren't people there who are quite capable of managing conflict, but it's because when they get in, the environment that they find is not one that says, this is a place for you, this is a space for you, and you are connected here. And so that's what I hope people take away from my chapter. That's what I took away from it anyway. Kristine, if you're talking to us, you're muted.
Of course I am. I just wanted to thank you for what you said about your chapter. And it just kind of reminds me of all the different organizations I've been part of and how hard these conversations are for so many reasons, many that are illustrated in your chapter. So thank you for your work on that. So at this point, there's a final question for both, and then we'll move into the Q&A. So since Cheryl just spoke, we'll start with Cherise. So the question is, in your chapter, you both offer hope and a vision for a more inclusive field. As you speak with us today with members of the Institute, what one or two or three things do we really need to understand together and to act on to recenter our work as an institute and really be more inclusive in a real and meaningful way?
It's a great question. I've probably been thinking about it for a long time. Where I always start is with ourselves. So I think since 2020, we've taken upon the desire to look at the organization and look at, what do we need to do as the Institute to really be more inclusive, look at issues of diversity and equity and inclusion. I've not been following the progress, so I hope that it continues. As so often happens, something bad happens, and then we try to do something good, and then it fades from the spotlight and it's forgotten. And so I hope that we continue in those efforts for the Institute to look at these issues. One of the things, so there's that, but with that is our own work that we need to do as practitioners. One of our premises is people have a unique reality. In mediation, people have a unique reality based on their life experience. Well, what does that mean? I see Eric here. He could do the journal article, right? Get that journal article out there. So the literature that helps us understand what does that mean for practice. Fortunately, I'm with a great group of folks focused on transformative dialogue, and we've actually jumped into the fire to look at our premises and how do we really look at issues of power and identity, because they do matter for every single person, both the practitioner and the participant. So I think as a collective, if we can continue to explore what power and identity mean, particularly as it comes to race and ethnicity and gender and language and economic advantage and disadvantage, I think in general, we don't understand what all that means, and we often get pushback. This is just about race. Why are the Americans just talking about, race? And it's like, well, but there's also other components of power and identity that impact conflict. And we're also in our dialogue work looking at, what does it mean to be trauma aware and trauma informed? Because if we think about that, thinking about what it means to experience trauma, so many people experience trauma based on their identity and who they are. So my hope for the Institute is for us to continue the good work that we've started since 2020, looking at issues of diversity, equity, inclusion. I do think we need to look around and literally see who's at the table when we have these conversations, although not all identities are visible. I think we need to continue to keep doing the work, our own individual work. And I think, like Cheryl was saying, when someone has a brave conversation and raises it, we need to be able to walk the talk of our work. And so those are the things that I hope for us as an institute, for us to continue to explore the premise of unique reality, link it to power and identity, link it to the social structures and cultures that people are embedded in that create disadvantage and exclusion. And I think that will be some really good ways for the Institute to continue forward.
Thank you, Cherise. It's really good points, really good advice. As one of the inclusion advocates, and I'm looking at Carol because she kind of really made us put action to our DEIB efforts. And I, myself, I'm not doing a good enough job, and it really highlights that. So I appreciate your words. Cheryl.
So, as you were talking, Kristine, and I was thinking about the inclusion advocates, which first of all, let me applaud the Institute in deciding that there were changes that they needed to make structurally. I appreciate that. I appreciate the work that Carol and Eric, I had the pleasure of being a part of. And one of them is developing inclusion advocates, which although there are people on every committee and every part of the Institute who has a responsibility for pointing out when we're about to make a decision, or you're having a conversation in which you are leaving out those people who are not typically in the room. One of the things that I want to leave with the Institute is it is everybody's responsibility. It is everybody's responsibility to notice, to say, hey, wait a minute, we're about to make a decision, or we're about to do something that is not representative of belonging and connectedness, even with the inclusion advocates. So I hope that the Institute will remember that. I hope that the Institute, particularly as you begin to take in members, will think about what diversity of practice means. Because not everybody who's going to come and join the Institute are, necessarily transformative practitioners in the way that people might think. So what happens with that group? So I'm glad, again, to see that the Institute is doing those kinds of things, and just hope that they remember and keep in mind what belonging and connectedness really means, what it means to have somebody come into your home, because that's what this is, your home, your Institute. Do they feel a sense of, yes, this is a place for me? And if they don't, how do we rectify that? I hope that the Institute will keep that in mind. I hope that, as Cherise said, unfortunately, the murder of Black and Brown people have not stopped. So I hope that your efforts don't stop. There seems to be that ebb and flow. Something happens, George Floyd, okay, let's do this. And then other things take priority. If you're really going to create an environment of belonging and connectedness, it is an everyday operation. It is an everyday effort. There's not a lull, because hopefully new people are coming in, or people who have been there are getting involved. So I hope that that effort keeps up and continues. I was glad to be a part of that first development of inclusion advocates. I'm glad to hear, Christina, that you are one of them. The feeling that I'm not doing enough, okay, keep that feeling. Because if you keep that feeling, you will continue to keep doing. At the point that you decide you've done enough, we're in trouble. Because probably you haven't. Probably there are people out there who, whether they say it or not, are not really feeling like the Institute is a place that they can come and really feel a sense of belonging and connectedness for whatever reason. So I just want to say to the Institute, I applaud the work that you're doing, and I sincerely hope that it keeps going.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I agree. So it's time for
we're doing, Cheryl. You're still doing it.
That's right. That's right, Carol. Yeah, feel free to unmute if you'd like. It's time for people to ask questions. You can do that in the chat, or you can, if you want to use the raise hand function, I'll call on people individually just to keep some semblance of order. So what questions do you have for our two authors and friends?
Carol, Carol, Elaine, I see those two hands.
Thank you. We'll start with Carol and then we'll go to Elaine.
Great, thanks. Of course, I have like a gazillion questions, but the one that's popping up most for me, it relates to your chapter, Cheryl, but I'm sure you'd have things to say about it too, Cherise. I'd be curious. You use subheaders, microaggressions, and intent versus impact, and those are important terminology that's kind of emerged in the last many years, and I just wonder what you think about them and how helpful or how sometimes I feel like using terminology that people can sort of grab a hold of, but they don't go deeper, versus having a word for something that resonates for multiple people who've experienced microaggressions or who have been confronted with our own intent versus impact defense argument. Or do you understand my question? I'm not articulating it very well, but what do you think at this moment, looking at your chapter, about those two terms, or the kind of woke terminology, and whether it is helpful or how it gets responded to? Or yeah.
So I use those terms, one, because I think most people at least have heard them and would understand them based on the audience of the book. Intent and impact are terms that I have used and continue to use even now as I teach or have workshops about belonging and connectedness. One, a person understands what an intent is, whether we take it out of the conflict resolution, whether I'm talking about it from a legal standpoint, however I'm talking about it, people tend to understand what intent means. So if I can take intent and then talk about, okay, so you understand what intent means and you got that, what's the impact? What happened when you did X? And so, yeah, I use them because people seem to understand them. I don't know if, I didn't really think about coming up with something new because I wanted people to really look at, I didn't want people to grapple with the new part in terms of, the headings on the sections, for example. What I wanted people to grasp was what was in between the sections. So that's why those words, and like I said, I still use them. Did that help?
It does. And for me, it's not in any way like a criticism of those terms in your chapter. It's more like, in my conversations, I sometimes feel like there's a way that we get a term like intent versus impact, and then we don't go to a next level of applying that to the moment or to ourselves. That's my concern sometimes, also with microaggressions.
Well, I think it helps to, at least when I do it, to talk about what, or to ask the person, because oftentimes I don't know what your intent is. I'm not a mind reader, but I'm grasping from what happened that this was your intent, but this is the impact. And for me, when it comes to race, et cetera, very often, I don't really care what your intent was. I really don't. I want you to recognize and talk about and acknowledge what the impact of what you did had on the other person or had on me. Because oftentimes what I get is my heart was in the right place. My heart was in the right place. Well, you're still breathing, so I assume that your heart's in the right place. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in you understanding what you did and what it caused, how it hurt, how it landed. So yeah, I hope that we go beyond just the words and give people understanding in terms of what those words meant and what they mean to me.
Yeah. And I think as we're talking, I'm thinking about weakness and self-absorption, because I think there's a lot in intent and impact that mirrors those experiences. Anyway, thank you. And Cherise, if you have anything you want to say about it, I'm curious too. But
I might chime in, but I'm curious what Elaine wants to ask.
So what I am grappling with at this point in my journey is adding a J to that DEI. So it's justice. And, I see lots of conversations in recent years, lots of people having the hard conversations and small superficial changes being made on the surface. But I am not sure at this point. I know it's not enough, and I don't know when I cross that road to being a radical bleeding heart liberal when I start saying we really need restoration, we need reparations, we need institutional and political change. And I think that, when you talked about people being able to walk into an institution and saying, is this place for me? I think as an American, we should walk into our institutions and say, does this belong to me? And I don't feel like marginalized people get to say this belongs to me. I am American, this belongs to me in this country. And I also feel like, just looking at my own office, for example, okay, in Maryland, give or take, about 30% of the population is African American. In my office of 11 people, we have one African American person. We recently went through a hiring process, and I said, well, can we look at historically Black colleges and universities to make sure that we have plenty of good candidates? And we had one good candidate, but they didn't get chosen, somebody else did. And I'm not saying that the person that was chosen wasn't a great candidate, but we have one African American person in our team of 11. That's less than 10% representation. And at the same time, as a white person, maybe I should step back from my position, but I'm also afraid to lose those benefits and et cetera. I don't know. I just feel like it's to really make change. It's really a lot harder than these conversations. And I don't know. So I'm just wondering what y'all think about how does justice fit into this?
Well, I do think it is hard to make change through conversations, right? We have to, I keep going back to it. It's our inner work. And it sounds like you're, trying to do your work, Elaine. Where do I fit? How do I use my voice? How do I use my capital, whatever your capital is? And you use your capital to say, hey, look. And so, I think that is part of the work. And organizations need, accomplices, as I write about in my book from one of my, we need people who are in it. I mean, this is our organization. And so I think the justice piece, it has to show up in the actual policies and procedures, but the environment. And so, there's work there to be done in your organization. In community mediation, we're one of our hallmarks is, does our staff, do our volunteers reflect the diversity of the community we serve? And in our center, often, there is an imbalance. And so what do you do if people are not stepping up to volunteer, right? You don't sit back and rest on your laurels. You go, hey, we need to get out into the community and make sure we're doing outreach so that people can see us. And so I do think that the awareness starts with conversations, the critical consciousness, as we used to say back in the day in my early feminist activism, it starts with critical consciousness, but then we have to take that action out in the world. And I think you're on that path, but you can't do that alone. So I'll let Cheryl chime in, because it feels like you've had a bit more brutal than I have at that high level of, organization, right? I mean, I've had little brutal, you've had big brutal, but I'll let you chime in there in terms of being the lone voice, like what I hear Elaine trying to do. I'm trying to do the right thing. I'm trying to live my values. I'm trying to put this stuff we say is important, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice into play, into reality, so that it helps. But I'm just by myself here. How do I do more?
It is difficult. It is hard. And it is for a number of reasons. One is because in this country, it is in our soil. It is in every institution. It is everywhere. It is so pervasive. So when in my little world, when I make a step forward and I look around, it's like, oh, gee, was that enough? No, it's never going to be enough. Okay. It just isn't, unfortunately. And I don't know if I'm supposed to give the bad news here, but anyway, there's so much work that has to be done. And Elaine, what I would say to you is keep raising it, keep looking for opportunities. That's what we all do. That's what I'm doing. Is it ever enough? No. And it's not, because it is so pervasive. But if each of us, and it doesn't take everyone, it takes, each of us who are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice. And boy, I hate acronyms, but okay. Doing our part where we are all the time, and recognizing that there are going to be times and days where you miss it, and there will be times and days where you hit it. Don't spend so much time on the times and days that you miss it. Remember and keep working for those changes incrementally as they are. But those are what makes, they kind of grow together for bigger changes. So I just encourage you to keep asking the question, keep saying, where are they? Keep being that voice. We all need to be so. But yeah, it is discouraging. It is. I wish it weren't, but it is. And Christina, you can't, okay, so you're talking to us without your mute, but you
Again,
can't leave us on that note, okay?
I'm not going to. No way. No way.
Thank
We have
you.
more
Thank
time.
you. Good, good.
And I think Dusty, you were waving at me. So
Yes, thank you. I'm just, I'm curious from Cherise and Cheryl, how they feel about cause for optimism, and I partly to just frame my question. I look back at how much I've grown in the last 20 or 25 years with regard to race and privilege and all of these issues, and how far I probably still have to go. But a big part of that is that the first 50 years of my life, and school life and work life, I mean, not so good. I thought I was a pretty good guy, but I'm a little embarrassed to look back at how ill-informed and ignorant I was. Now, like a lot of people, I tend to look at our children and our grandchildren, and what I see is that I think that partly this is going to be helped a lot by generational change. And I can be a little optimistic about that. And I just wonder how the two of you feel about that. Do we have some room for optimism just in the changing demographics of who's coming behind us?
Well, I go out bigger than that. We have to have optimism, because if there's no optimism, there's death, right? And I'll be 56 this year. I put it out there, and I'm starting to go, man, my hope is for these kids. You gotta help us. you gotta please help us, right? Because I think this younger generation of young people, a good number of them are like, I think they get it, and they understand the collective. We're on this little blue marble, and it's like we're polluting it, and we're doing all these things. So for me, I have to have optimism, because the alternative is just really frightening to me. And that also helps me. I've gotten really clear, that I can't save the world all by myself. And so when I join with others, that's very helpful. But I also know that there is power in my own healing and health and well-being. And I put my focus there, because when I'm as well as I can be, and coming from a place of love, that love shines out into the world. And if that light touches one person or is seen by one person, then hopefully, that's the part that I can do. So that's part of how I, answered this really important question you're asking. I have to have hope. And I do see the younger people being part of the solution. But I think as adults, we have to get our stuff together too. So, I think about Elaine and what you were saying, for another person to hear you say that, your concerns about your organization, or, what you hope, they're going to see a role model there. And so I have to be hopeful that the younger folks and what we can teach them and help them see is part of the solution.
Absolutely. Yeah, without that, good gracious, why am I getting up in the morning? So I see it in a couple of places. I see it in the younger generation, but I also see it, I teach a class on various issues of diversity for a master's program for Tufts University at 6 o'clock on Friday, okay? 6 o'clock on Friday. I have 20 people on a Zoom talking about matters of diversity. And oftentimes what I will say to them is, one of the things that gives me hope is that 20 group of students who are in a master's program on, and they just added the J, by the way, where's Elaine? They just added the diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice to their long title. But the fact that you have decided to go into this field, decided to get, further education, a master's in this area, gives me hope that, you're going to be part of the change that is necessary, not just in the future, but right now, as you are learning and developing these skills, that you're going to take them and use them forward, as well as the younger generation as they are coming up. Yes, Dusty, that's what gives me hope. Absolutely. I'll say this, when the George Floyd murder was happening and all of that, I'm in Georgia. I have a recliner that sits in my bedroom that looks out onto a lake. And I had decided I was going to sit here on the lake in Georgia, stay in my apartment, and just, not worry about any of that, not get involved in that. And so I, felt sorry for myself for a little while. And then gradually people and organizations like the Institute came and said, can you help us? Can you help us do better? And I was like, oh, okay, there are people out there who want to do better, who want to improve. That's what gives me hope. That's what keeps me going.
I love that. It's a great place to end. I wish we had time for everyone to go around and say what brings them hope in the same way. And maybe we'll think about it ourselves as we leave today. I do want to encourage you. Let me see if I can do something here.
Are you looking for the book, Christy?
Yeah.
She has it right there.
Yeah, put it right up into the screen. So if you haven't read it, please read it. Share it with colleagues, put it on social media, book studies, courses. Everyone needs to read this book. It's a life-changing book, I think. It's definitely a perspective-changing book, or a perspective deepening. I don't know. It's just really good. And I'd like to see it more. I'd like to see it being offered in college courses. I mean, this is the kind of book we need. So, thank you, Lou, for putting it in the chat.
Yep, thanks.
And thank you for all of you for being here, and thank mostly to Cheryl and Cherise for having the courage to speak about your chapters and about your personal experiences. We've learned and grown because of it. So thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thanks.